It is Thursday, August the 16th, 2018. This is the Dissident Peasant Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff, the Dissident Peasant. On today's show, John Brown, the Epilogue, his death, his memory, his descendants, ideological and biological. We will explore all of this and more. Thanks for joining me. I just want to tell you quickly that this show is brought to you by people like you. You can go to patreon.com/distantpeasant and become a recurring supporter for as little as $1 a month. And thank you. I need your support. There's also a PayPal button at my website, distantpeasant.com. Something new. The email address bigboss@distantpeasant.com was up. Then it was down. Now it is up again. Please send all friendly corrections on facts, pronunciations, show ideas, feedback, media critique, advertisement, whatever. Send everything officially to bigboss@distantpeasant.com. Please and thank you. In the wake of John Brown's death, his war of liberation to free the slave would be fought, though not exactly along the lines that he imagined. Brown was executed late in 1859. In April of 1861, of course, Confederate forces will attack and capture Fort Sumter, marking the traditional start date of the American Civil War. Now, when precisely this war became a war to abolish slavery and not just preserve the Union is a question whose answer depends upon whom you ask. At the breakout of hostilities, there were some in the North, of course, already convinced by Brown's sacrifice, as well as the sacrifice of countless other people, black and white, that a war was necessary to free the slaves. But by and large, this conclusion took time for folks to reach. Although by January 1st, 1863, and the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation, it's indisputable that the Union Army became one of liberation. But we are not really here to explore the history of the Civil War. The details of military campaigns are a little boring to me, and I doubt I could even do a decent job of describing them if I tried. But by the end of the war, John Brown's body would be the most popular song in the Union Army, and John Brown would be mainstreamed as a hero among most of the Northern population. His sanity was no longer questioned. Enough time had passed to allow the distinction between John Brown's quote-unquote insane plan and the literal sanity of John Brown to become apparent. His strategy, his tactics, all empirically unsound, all doomed to failure, but he wasn't crazy. However, let's take for a moment, just for a moment, that John Brown really was picking a fight with a military plan he thought would work. Who else presented themselves to lead this first operation to arm a slave rebellion? What great general or military officer of any significant rank came forward with a better plan? Who was equal in zeal for the cause of liberty? Who felt the fierce urgency of now? None had presented themselves to Brown when he had carefully and secretly fundraised throughout the North for his operation. Captain Brown was all alone, and nonetheless felt forced by his God to free the slaves, at least from his point of view. Now, I don't want to needlessly quibble with Brown's theology, but slavery is, of course, biblically supported in testaments both old and new. And it was extremely possible to be a Christian in the United States in the 1800s and be a slaver. Now, I think Brown gives himself far too little credit, actually. It was not really the law of God that drove Brown to action, though doubtlessly the language of God in the Bible gave him the thoughts and words to channel his belief into action. But it was something special about the man himself, a bright burning flame that compelled him to hold the slave as his equal. As Frederick Douglass himself would put it in 1881, quote, His zeal in the cause of my race was far greater than mine. It was as the burning sun to my taper light. Mine was bounded by time. His stretched away to the boundless shores of eternity. I could live for the slave, but he could die for him." Unquote. So, John Brown, good guy, right? And even if one didn't think so, he certainly wasn't insane. He was mainstream. He knew what he was doing. You need look no further than the 180,000 black people who enlisted in the Union Army, or to the absolutely essential and courageous resistance among black people in the South in slavery during the war, in order to realize that John Brown's vision became reality. And so opinions on him stood for a time. Now, when did they turn and why? Well, we'll answer the second question first. Why? Let's go to 1876. It's a presidential election year. Tempers are hot. The previous year's state elections in Reconstruction-era Mississippi featured armed groups of white Democrats shooting or threatening to shoot enough black and white Republicans if they tried to vote to carry the elections. Hundreds of people were killed. Federal troops were not mobilized, and the Republican governor had to flee for his life from the state. This sort of violence of 1875 in Mississippi would be repeated across many parts of the South in 1876. Murder and intimidation from supporters of the so-called Southern Redeemer governments that will come to dominate the South for the rest of the century were rising. The worst violence probably took place in Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida, and the elections were marked with fraud and trickery perpetrated almost entirely by the Democratic side. In some cases, competing factions in states both sent electors to D.C., with both claiming that they were all the rightful representatives to the Electoral College. Honestly, it was a huge mess, and to avoid coming to blows over the whole thing, a commission was appointed by Congress to decide who would be president. After the necessary dramatic maneuvering and last-minute antics, the Democrats, opposed to the interests of the Republican voting former slaves and their white allies, would accept the election of Ohio's Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican. Though already a public squish on the project of using federal troops to enforce the enfranchisement of black people. However, they had a couple conditions. Firstly, and most importantly, those so-called Redeemer governments had taken over every other state in the South. Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina were all still occupied by federal troops. Funny how those three states with federal troops still in them to protect the new freedom of black folks to vote went Republican. Condition 1 was no more of that. Federal troops were gone. Reconstruction is over. North and South are reconciled. So please, let's get on with the business of getting along and not worrying so much about these black people. Please. Other terms, some of which were never actually delivered on, were hammered out by the Republicans and Democrats on the commission. But the final was a recognition on the South's right to, quote, deal with the blacks without Northern read federal interference. Now, what happened next would take a few years to fully shake out, but by and large, this was the beginning of the end of competitive elections in the Deep South until 1948 at a national level, with the South basically becoming a one-party police state for black people again, though admittedly one not quite as horrific as the status quo antebellum. This era begins the popularization of terms like scalawag, white people in the South who voted Republican, and carpetbaggers, white people from the North who moved south to work, teach, or rebuild the South post-war and were accused of profiteering. As well as the widespread belief that persists to this day that these progressive governments of the Reconstruction era in the South, who held power through a coalition of white and black votes, were corrupt, inefficient, and wasteful. Now, certainly no government anywhere on earth has ever been wholly pure of any malice or selfish desire, but this is simply not the case. Public education in the South makes its debut around this time, It previously didn't exist for either whites or blacks. Progressive taxation comes up, public improvements, judicial reform, all of this opposed by the reactionary neo-feudal former slave power in the South, with any and every measure including murder and rioting. But these were good policies. They weren't to last. All this is to say, by 1890, we have entered what African-American historian Rayford Logan referred to as the nadir of race relations in America. National and statewide representation were the first to go, but between 1890 and 1907, every single southern state and border state had legally disenfranchised their black populations. Even their local affairs now were run by white Democrats. Segregation increased, actually. Jackie Robinson didn't integrate Major League Baseball in 1947. He reintegrated it after white players forced out blacks in 1889. In 1911, Kentucky Derby jockeys were resegregated. One of the most important American works of fiction ever produced, Uncle Tom's Cabin, goes through rewrites around this time. And the titular character of the anti-slavery novel goes from sacrificial martyr to sentimental dope of kindly masters. To this day, to be called an Uncle Tom in the African-American community is to be a scoundrel willing to sell out his own people. Blackface becomes huge. Minstrel songs enter the consciousness in a big way. The Bronx Zoo holds an African man in a caged exhibit near the gorillas. This is the age of Gone with the Wind and Birth of a Nation. Those African Americans who sought to form separate but prosperous enclaves for themselves and pursue Booker T. Washington's suggested project of economic improvement would find their settlements surrounded by sundown towns where it was not safe to be black and in the city after the sunset. Before these enclaves were often outright looted and destroyed by white mob violence. Hopefully you get the idea by now. Now, as you might imagine, during this time, the reputation and character of John Brown, our hero this episode, also changes. Increasingly among the whites of the North and South both, to be a white person overly dedicated to the rights and well-being of black people made you crazy. Why wouldn't you care about your own as much as you do the other? And if the more dedicated to the project one is, well, the crazier they are. And if that's the case, well, John Brown's the craziest of them all. According to the scholarship of Dr. James Lowen, John Brown basically keeps his sanity until about 1890. But after that, he loses it until at least the 1970s in our history textbooks. At the time, and even today, this lack of sanity is and was usually either explicitly or implicitly connected with his faith. John Brown was a zealot and a terrorist for his twisted idea of the Christian God, don't you know? And his faith was fanatical and dangerous, or something similar, they'll say. Now, I am no man of faith, but one need not have faith to explain that it was not Brown's faith that made people think he was crazy, but his perceived traitorousness to his own race. Nat Turner was a slave and a Christian. He was deeply religious and privileged among slaves. He could read his Bible, just like John Brown. He organized a 2-day-long slave rebellion that killed dozens of people in Virginia in 1831. And what's more, Nat Turner saw things, heard things, received visions and revelations, he claimed, none of which Brown claimed. Nowhere is Nat Turner depicted as a fanatical Christian or insane for leading a slave rebellion and hearing the voice of God, despite the evidence that he was far, quote-unquote, crazier, to use the parlance of the past, than John Brown ever was, because Nat Turner killed to free other black people. Brown fought, killed, and died as a white man for black people. It is only their race that truly explains why Brown is vaguely regarded as a religious fanatic, and Nat Turner is not. And viewing Brown as crazy does neither white folk nor black folk any good. Malcolm X in Part 1 notwithstanding, some black nationalists and militants would point to Brown's insanity as proof that no white person could ever really hold their best interests at heart. As soon as they could, the forces of white supremacy have seized upon the memory of John Brown with a mixture of outright hostility and venom, mixed with barely disguised concern trolling, grasping for anything and everything they can in this project, from omitted context to half-truths to outright lies, to tear John Brown down. Why? It's certainly not fidelity to the truth, I think most people can agree. It's because they recognize, maybe intuitively, the potential power of such an example as John Brown, and the need, as best they can, to deny or sap its power. John Brown's historical reputation has been somewhat rehabilitated in the late 20th and early 21st century, though it remains incredibly mixed. If you ever meet anyone who claims to know their American history, questions about how they view Brown are often an important barometer of how seriously you should take them. Serious historical scholarship, while certainly capable of criticizing Brown, especially for his actions at Potawatomi, has drifted closer to the view long held by the great African-American historians and thinkers of the United States, like Du Bois, Douglas, and more recent scholars like Ron Bennett Jr. John Brown's legacy lives on, of course, not just in the arts and history, but through his literal descendants. On the 4th of July, 1860, all of old John Brown's family and living company gathered at the old farm in North Elba, New York, where the land had been bought outright by the community and given communally to the family. Included in this company were his 8 surviving children. As for the children of his first wife, Dianthe, Owen Brown was the sole surviving son of John Brown who participated in the raid at Harper's Ferry and survived. He would wander with a price on his head for a time, and additionally he was described in old John's will as a cripple, having lost some use in his right arm as a boy in an accident. These 2 facts would mean he would not serve in the Union Army during the war. If you read of an Owen Brown who did serve as an officer in the Union Army, it is probably Owen, son of Frederick Brown, the younger brother of old John Brown, who served in the 88th Illinois Infantry. The last of the raiders to die, Owen would pass away in Pasadena, California, where more or less the entire town of 2000 will travel to his gravesite to pay respect. A marker reading Owen Brown, son of John Brown, the Liberator, died January 9th, 1889, was placed there and disappeared in 2002 for 10 years before being recovered. A replica was placed on the spot in 2017. The original is somewhere the government of Pasadena will not say. Brown Mountain in California was actually named by Owen and his brother Jason for their dear old dad. Brother Jason, who was a far more humane man than his father and not enthusiastic at all about violence, eventually moved back to Ohio after Owen's death, where he ultimately died December 24th, 1912. If I have less to say about Jason than I might blame the white supremacist thugs who set fire to his home and destroyed his letters before Jason's return east. Jason Brown would father 4 children, one of whom survived to adulthood, Charles Peter Brown. John Brown Jr. was old John's eldest, although he was not president at Harper's Ferry. He was in fact trusted to operate as an intelligence agent and liaison between John Brown and his backers, as well as a recruiter and scout. He would serve briefly as a captain in the Union Army before his death forced his resignation, and lived on 10 acres on South Bass Island on Lake Erie until he died May 3rd, 1895. Their sister Ruth Brown also arrived in Pasadena, California in 1884 and called it her home for 20 years. She married Henry Thompson. According to her obituary, she was survived by a single son, John Henry Thompson, and was sent just a ton of flowers, including some lovely carnations by the widow of the dead President Garfield in 1904. As for the 4 surviving children of his second wife, Mary, Salmon, son of old John, would attempt to serve in the Union Army as an officer, but the notoriety of his name and his participation in the events at Potawatomi would result in a petition from the officers asking for his removal. Salmon resigned his commission and headed west also to California, where he would eventually be joined by his sisters Annie, Sarah, and Ellen, as well as Mother Mary. They, on the way, would be set upon by Confederate sympathizers during their wagon journey until reaching the safety of Federal soldiers in Soda Springs, Idaho, where they got an armed escort. Salmon Brown would eventually run a farm and raise a large family in California before moving to Oregon. Paralyzed and bedridden, he committed suicide in Portland, Oregon in 1919 for what most suspect were reasons having nothing at all to do with Harper's Ferry at the age of 82. He was John Brown's last living son. His sister Ellen Brown would marry James Fablinger and have children, but Sarah Brown, her sister, would never marry. They are buried next to their mother in what is now the Madronia Cemetery in Santa Clara County, California, where they share a marker. They may have died 16 days apart from each other, according to the National Park Service, which lists their deaths as occurring in the summer of 1916, but their grave marker lists their year of death as 1917. Sarah Brown would leave us a bit of art, including 2 wonderful portraits she did of her mother and father, and a legacy as a teacher to children and caretaker for Mother Mary for the rest of her life. Lastly, daughter Annie Brown would embrace her role as John Brown's daughter for a time. She served as a teacher to freed slaves in Virginia for 6 months before she headed west. Both she and her sister Sarah would teach in California, with Annie even volunteering to teach at the school for blacks the town over, which included boarding with a black family. After marrying and starting her own family, however, she became far more reserved about her legacy and spoke little about John Brown to her children. She refused an invitation to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, stating that she had no interest in being placed on exhibition like some relic or curio. I found a letter to Anna Brown Adams dated June 14th, 1896. It's from Ida B. Wells, editor of the Conservator Organ of the Colored People. It reads, quote, Mrs. Anna Brown Adams, my dear madam, news of your misfortune has caused thousands of our race who love the memory of your martyred father to sympathize with you and lend an helping hand in your hour of need. We cannot do very much, but what we attach is most gratefully done. There is more to the letter, but frankly, that was hard enough for me to decipher from the cursive. Annie Brown, of all the children particularly, deserves much of our thanks today. She was many times a help to biographers and historians throughout the years researching John Brown, at least according to her maternal granddaughter Alice Louise Hunt, who once buttoned Grandma Ann's shoes and carried her meals to her. Annie was the last of John Brown's children to die in 1926. Little Annie, who once searched the horizon as John Brown's eyes in that Maryland cabin as a lookout for weeks on end. For that most far-seeing and courageous American abolitionist of them all. So, what of the example of John Brown? Where are his ideological descendants? Where is the next John Brown? On what issues will the next John Brown join the fight? Well, John Brown was executed by the forces of the government and order in his militancy. In some sense, his legacy is all martyrs for political and social revolution who've fallen at the hands of these forces. Anarchist union organizers gunned down by the police, or Black Panthers whose organization is beset by unprovoked white violence. These are a little like John Brown, perhaps. Norman Morrison was a 31-year-old Quaker who set himself on fire beneath the office of Secretary McNamara on November 2nd, 1965, to protest the Vietnam War. He did not die swinging or captured and hung post-battle like Brown, but nonetheless gave his life in an attempt to shake the country from its stupor, as Brown put it. In fact, the Vietnam War would cause at least 4 Americans to self-immolate as a form of protest, following the example of Thich Quang Duc the Buddhist monk who set himself ablaze in a Saigon intersection in 1963 and would also inspire imitators in his own country. The Vietnam War would continue for years, of course, after these immolations, just as slavery continued for years after John Brown. In the end, however, the Vietnam War did end, though anything like justice and equity for Vietnam or any other colonialized power in the world remains elusive, much like the legacy of slavery and white supremacy in the United States, where true equality is equally elusive in terms of wages, housing, wealth, and political power for today's descendants of slaves. Just as liberated slaves had the vote in the Reconstruction-era South until they didn't, so have the gains since the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s been clawed back through reactionary Supreme Court rulings on the Voting Rights Act, as an example. There is a way to honor John Brown's legacy, short of grabbing a gun and making war upon City Hall, I think. What truly made his abolitionism so radical during its time was not its anti-slavery character. In truth, by the time Harper's Ferry occurred, anti-slavery sentiment across the North was more than common. But of these anti-slavery people, only a few truly imagined a society where black people were not just free but had the vote, were not just paid but paid equally, did not just live in peace but lived among whites as neighbors. And of these, John Brown stood nearly without parallel. Forces both positive and negative will claim the Christian God as their champion on slavery. And so, with all due respect to those who truly believe that it was divinity that made John Brown so unique, I do not agree. It was his personal connection to the slaves of his day, whom he described as the children of God, him and them both. But what he really recognized in them was not common divinity, but common humanity. So let us all recognize the humanity in one another and never be afraid to embrace it. I'll leave you with this one more quote by W.E.B. Du Bois. This, then, is the truth. The cost of liberty is less than the price of repression, even though that cost be blood. Freedom of development and equality of opportunity is the demand of Darwinism, and this calls for the abolition of hard and fast lines between races, just as it called for the breaking down of barriers between classes. Only in this way can the best in humanity be discovered and conserved, and only thus can mankind live in peace and progress. The present attempt to force all whites above all darker peoples is a sure method of human degeneration. The cost of liberty is thus a decreasing cost, while the cost of repression ever tends to increase to the danger point of war and revolution. Revolution is not a test of capacity. It is always a loss and a lowering of ideals. John Brown taught us that the cheapest price to pay for liberty is its cost today. It is now full 50 years since this white-haired old man lay weltering in the blood which he spilled for broken and despised humanity. Let the nation which he loved and the South to which he spoke reverently listen again today to those words, as prophetic now as then. You had better, all you people of the South, prepare yourselves for a settlement of this question. It must come up for settlement sooner than you are prepared for it, and the sooner you commence that preparation, the better for you. You may dispose of me very easily. I am very nearly disposed of now, but this question is still to be settled. This Negro question, I mean. The end of that is not yet. Tune in next week. Who knows what I'll have? Fun stuff, interesting stuff. Just have to check me out next week. Until then, stay dissident, serfs.